I'm Beatrice Rogers, 31, a disaster response coordinator who's helped rebuild water systems after disasters. For years, I sent money home and even cut deployments short to support my dad when he lost his job. But when he mocked me at a family party, "She's still unemployed," I drew a line that changed everything. Ever been publicly belittled by someone you stood by? Tell me in the comments. You're not alone. Before I dive in, tell me where you're watching from, and if you've ever had to stand up for yourself, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and taking your life back. What happened next might surprise you. The comments started small. Dinner conversations where Dad would glance at me with that expression, part concern, part disappointment, and say something like, "Well, at least someone at this table is still figuring things out." Everyone would laugh because it sounded like harmless teasing, but I felt the barb every time. It escalated gradually. Family barbecues where he'd introduce me to his friends with, "This is my daughter, the one I told you about. Still searching for her calling." The phrase "still searching" became his favorite weapon, deployed with surgical precision whenever I walked into a room full of relatives. My cousin Beatrice got engaged, and during the congratulations, Dad turned to me. "Don't worry, honey. Your time will come. Some people just take longer to get their lives together." The whole table went quiet for exactly 2 seconds before my aunt jumped in with some comment about the wedding cake flavors. At Christmas gatherings, he'd ask pointed questions designed to highlight what I wasn't accomplishing. "Any job prospects? Still living alone? You know your mother worries." He'd frame these interrogations as fatherly concern, but his timing was always public, always calculated for maximum exposure. The subtle cruelty of it was that he never said anything overtly cruel. He maintained plausible deniability, just a worried father checking in on his struggling daughter. But the pattern was unmistakable. Every achievement I mentioned got deflected or minimized. Every setback got amplified and discussed at length. Last Easter, I mentioned getting selected for a specialized training program. Something I'd worked months to qualify for, something that mattered to me. Dad nodded politely and said, "That's nice, sweetheart. Just make sure it leads somewhere this time." Then he immediately pivoted to praising my brother's recent promotion, spending 15 minutes detailing why his corporate advancement was such a success story. The family dynamic had crystallized around this narrative Dad had created. I was the cautionary tale, the family member who served as proof that not everyone figures it out. My siblings had learned to stay quiet during these moments, not wanting to draw his criticism toward themselves. My mother would offer weak protests, now frank, but never anything strong enough to actually stop him. Other relatives played along because it was easier than confronting him. Uncle Jim would pat my shoulder sympathetically and say things like, "You'll find your path." My grandmother would slip me $20 bills and whisper about how everyone blooms in their own time. Their kindness only reinforced the fundamental assumption that I was someone who needed fixing. The worst part was how I started internalizing it. I'd walk into family gatherings already braced for impact, already defensive about questions I knew were coming. I'd practice responses in my car before walking into the house, trying to find ways to deflect or minimize the inevitable commentary about my life choices. Dad seemed to enjoy the role he'd assigned himself as the family truth-teller, the one brave enough to point out what everyone else was too polite to mention. He'd often preface his comments with phrases like, "I'm just being honest," or "Someone has to say it." This gave him permission to say things that would sound harsh coming from anyone else. The pressure to prove myself became overwhelming. I started accepting invitations to events I didn't want to attend, just to show I was social. I'd mention every small professional opportunity, hoping something would finally earn his approval. I applied for jobs I didn't want because they sounded impressive on paper. Nothing worked. Every effort to meet his expectations just provided new material for his commentary. Got a temporary position? At least it's something. Moved to a better apartment? Must be nice to finally have some stability. Started dating someone? Don't get ahead of yourself. The family had organized itself around accommodating his behavior. Conversations would flow around his comments like water around rocks. Someone would always jump in with a subject change when things got too uncomfortable. My mother had perfected the art of the immediate redirect, launching into detailed discussions about dessert recipes or neighborhood gossip the moment Dad's needling went too far. But the damage accumulated. Every gathering chipped away a little more at my confidence, my sense of belonging in my own family. I started arriving late and leaving early. I'd volunteer for kitchen duty to avoid sitting at the main table where I'd be an easier target for his observations. My siblings began treating me with a mixture of pity and relief. Pity because they could see what was happening, relief because Dad's focus on my shortcomings meant less scrutiny of their own lives. They'd offer generic support afterward. Don't let him get to you, or he doesn't mean anything by it. But they never intervened in the moment when it mattered. The insidious thing about this kind of treatment is how it becomes normalized. Dad's running commentary on my failures became as much a part of family gatherings as his famous barbecue sauce or my mother's apple pie. People expected it. They prepared for it. Some even seemed entertained by it, in the way audiences are entertained by predictable dynamics in a long-running television show. I realized I'd become a character in a story Dad was telling about himself, the patient father dealing with his disappointing daughter. Every public moment of my struggle validated his narrative about good parenting and tough love. He got to be simultaneously the concerned patriarch and the family's voice of reason. The setup was perfect for him and devastating for me. He'd created a dynamic where any success I achieved would be credited to his guidance, and any failure would prove his point about my character. I was trapped in a narrative where I couldn't win, performing my role as the family disappointment at every gathering while he collected sympathy and validation from an audience that had learned to see things through his eyes. That's how things stood when we all gathered for my aunt's retirement party. I walked into that house already knowing my place in the family hierarchy, already prepared for whatever observations Dad would make about my current situation. I had no idea I was walking toward a moment that would change everything between us forever. The retirement party was bigger than usual. Aunt Linda had invited colleagues, neighbors, family friends, people beyond our immediate circle who didn't know the established family dynamics. The living room buzzed with conversations about golf plans and cruise destinations, the kind of celebratory atmosphere that made Dad feel expansive and performative. I'd been there maybe 20 minutes, making polite conversation with my aunt's former coworkers, when I heard Dad's voice rise above the general chatter. He was holding court near the kitchen island, surrounded by my uncle's poker buddies and a few neighbors I recognized but didn't really know. Speaking of retirement, he said, gesturing toward me with his beer bottle, at least Linda earned hers. My daughter here is still trying to figure out what she wants to be when she grows up. A few people chuckled uncertainly. I felt that familiar heat spreading across my chest, the physical reaction I'd learned to expect in these moments. But this felt different. Bigger. More public than his usual needling. Someone asked what I did for work, probably trying to be polite and include me in the conversation. Dad jumped in before I could answer. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it, sweetheart? He took a long drink and shook his head with exaggerated sympathy. She's got a college degree and everything. Just can't seem to land anywhere permanent. The room was starting to pay attention now. Conversations were tapering off as people sensed something happening. I could see my mother across the room, her face already wearing that expression she got when she knew Dad was building toward something, but felt powerless to stop it. I keep telling her, he continued, his voice getting louder, more confident as he realized he had an audience. At some point you've got to stop making excuses and start making choices. Can't drift forever. My cousin Mark tried to redirect. Dad, didn't you mention wanting to show everyone those photos from your fishing trip? But Dad was on a roll now. He'd found his rhythm, and he wasn't stopping for anyone. You know what the problem is? He gestured broadly, speaking to the room now instead of to me. No accountability. This generation thinks they can just keep trying new things indefinitely. In my day, you picked a path and you stuck with it. I opened my mouth to respond, to defend myself, but he wasn't finished. She's still unemployed. The words came out louder than everything else he'd said, cutting through whatever conversations were still happening elsewhere in the room. He started laughing, not the uncomfortable chuckle he usually deployed, but real laughter, as if he'd just delivered a perfect punchline. The room went completely quiet. I stood there feeling like every eye was on me, waiting for my response, watching to see how I'd handle being publicly labeled a failure by my own father. Some people looked embarrassed for me. Others seemed uncomfortable witnessing this family dynamic playing out in such a public setting. A few were clearly waiting to see what would happen next, entertained by the drama. "She's still unemployed," he repeated, still chuckling, inviting others to join him in finding my situation amusing. That's when I understood something that had been building for years, but had never crystallized until this moment. This wasn't about concern for my future or tough love or any of the justifications he'd been using. This was about him needing an audience for his performance as the long-suffering father of a disappointment. He'd orchestrated this moment deliberately. He'd waited until the room was full, until he had people who didn't know me, who would take his word about who I was and what I represented. He'd turned my life into entertainment for his audience. I felt something shift inside me, something that had been bending under the weight of his criticism for years. It didn't break, it hardened. Crystallized into something sharp and clear and completely focused. "Actually," I said, loud enough for the room to hear, "I'm not unemployed." He blinked, surprised that I was pushing back instead of absorbing the blow silently like usual. "I've been working," I continued. "Just not in ways you understand or value." But even as I said it, I knew it didn't matter. The damage was done. He'd gotten what he wanted, the chance to publicly define me as a failure in front of an audience that would remember his version of the story long after they forgot anything I might say in response. The conversations gradually resumed, but the energy in the room had changed. I'd been marked, labeled, categorized. In the span of 30 seconds, Dad had managed to reduce everything I was trying to accomplish to a punchline about unemployment and drift. I stayed for another hour because leaving immediately would have felt like confirming his narrative. But I moved through the rest of the party like I was underwater, going through the motions of socializing while something much more significant shifted beneath the surface. Growing up, Dad was my hero. Not in some idealized childhood way, but genuinely, he was the parent who showed up to school events, who taught me to change a tire, who stayed up late helping me with science projects that were obviously beyond my capabilities. When I was 8 and announced I wanted to be a firefighter, he bought me a toy helmet and told everyone at the grocery store about his daughter who was going to save people for a living. When I switched to wanting to be a doctor at 10, he started pointing out ambulances on the road and explaining what the paramedics were probably doing. He encouraged big dreams. "Don't settle for ordinary," he'd tell me. "You're capable of more than that." Throughout high school, when I excelled academically, he'd beam with pride at parent-teacher conferences. My guidance counselor once told him I had unlimited potential, and he repeated that phrase for months afterward. He kept a folder of my report cards and honor roll certificates in his desk drawer. The problem started in college when my interests shifted toward service-oriented work. I wanted to join programs that would let me work in crisis zones, disaster relief, emergency response, fields where the compensation was minimal, but the impact was immediate and meaningful. "That's noble," he'd say, "but how will you support yourself?" After graduation, I took a position with an organization that deployed people to areas hit by natural disasters. The work was unpredictable, sometimes dangerous, always poorly paid. I'd be gone for months at a time, living in temporary housing, working 18-hour days helping communities rebuild. Dad never understood it. "You're wasting your education," he'd say. "You could be making real money with your skills." But the work mattered to me in ways I couldn't explain to him. When a hurricane devastated a coastal town, I was part of the team that coordinated emergency shelter for displaced families. When an earthquake destroyed water systems in remote areas, I helped establish temporary infrastructure that kept people alive until permanent repairs could be made. I tried to share these experiences with him to help him understand why I'd chosen this path. I'd call from temporary command centers and try to describe the satisfaction of solving complex logistical problems under pressure, of being part of something that genuinely helped people in crisis. "That's nice, honey," he'd say, "but what's your plan for the long term?" The disconnect became a wedge between us. He saw my work as an extended phase, something I'd eventually grow out of once I got serious about my future. I saw it as the most meaningful thing I'd ever done, Work that aligned perfectly with the values he'd taught me about service and helping others. During my deployments, I'd send updates about the projects I was working on. I'd email photos of schools we'd helped rebuild, water systems we'd restored, communities that were functioning again because of coordinated relief efforts. His responses were always brief and focused on when I'd be coming home. The irony was that everything I was doing reflected the principles he'd instilled in me as a child. He'd raised me to believe that helping others was the highest calling, that using your abilities to serve something bigger than yourself was what gave life meaning. But somewhere along the way, his definition of success had narrowed. It wasn't enough anymore to be doing important work. It had to be prestigious work, well-compensated work, work that looked impressive when he described it to his friends. I'd supported him through his own difficult period when he lost his job 3 years ago. I'd sent money from my emergency fund, had called every week to check on his mental state, had even cut short a deployment to come home when Mom said he was struggling with depression. "You don't have to do that," he'd said when I handed him the check to help cover their mortgage payment. But he'd taken it, and he'd seemed genuinely grateful. That's what made his public humiliation so much worse. I'd proven my loyalty to him repeatedly, had prioritized his well-being even when it cost me professionally. I'd defended his parenting to relatives who questioned why he was so hard on me. I'd absorbed his criticism without pushing back because I thought it came from a place of love. But standing in Aunt Linda's living room, watching him turn my life into a joke for his audience, I finally understood that his disapproval wasn't about my choices. It was about his need to be right, to be the authority figure whose judgment everyone respected. He didn't see me as his daughter anymore. He saw me as evidence of his failure as a parent, and he needed to distance himself from that failure by making it entirely my fault. Every public criticism was him trying to rewrite our story so that my unconventional path reflected my deficiencies rather than his inability to understand what I valued. The saddest part was that I'd spent years trying to bridge this gap, trying to help him see that my work was meaningful even if it wasn't conventional. I'd been hoping for understanding, maybe even pride. Instead, I'd given him ammunition he could use to diminish me in front of anyone who would listen. I left the party without saying goodbye to him. I hugged Aunt Linda, kissed my mother's cheek, and walked out to my car while he was still holding court by the kitchen island, probably moving on to some other topic now that he'd gotten his entertainment value from my humiliation. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and replayed conversations. I kept hearing his voice saying she's still unemployed and the laughter that followed. I kept seeing the faces in that room, some sympathetic, some entertained, all of them now carrying his version of who I was. By the time I reached my apartment, the humiliation had crystallized into something else. Clarity, maybe? Or just exhaustion from years of trying to earn respect from someone who had no intention of giving it. My phone started buzzing almost immediately. Text from my mother. "Don't take it personally, honey. He's been stressed about work." Text from cousin Beatrice. "That was really awkward. Are you okay?" Text from my sister. "Dad didn't mean anything by it. You know how he gets at parties." The same pattern that always followed these incidents, family members reaching out to smooth things over, to convince me that what I'd experienced wasn't as bad as it felt, to maintain the fiction that Dad's behavior was somehow acceptable because it was familiar. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I sat on my couch and thought about all the times I'd made excuses for him, all the moments when I'd swallowed my anger to preserve family harmony. I thought about the years I'd spent trying to translate my work into terms he'd understand, hoping to finally earn his approval. My phone rang. Dad's number. I stared at it until it stopped ringing, then listened to the voicemail. "Hey, sweetheart. Just wanted to make sure you got home safely. Listen, I hope you didn't take what I said too seriously tonight. You know I'm just looking out for you. Family dinner Sunday at Mom's, right? Love you." The casual dismissal of what had happened was almost worse than the original humiliation. He'd reduced me to a punchline in front of a room full of people, and now he was treating it like a minor misunderstanding that could be resolved with a quick phone call. I called my supervisor at the relief organization. Elena answered on the second ring, despite it being nearly 10 o'clock. "There's an opening on the Guatemala deployment," I told her without preamble. "That's a 6-month commitment minimum," she said. And the conditions are particularly challenging. We're still working on establishing basic infrastructure. I understand. Can you be ready to deploy in 72 hours? Yes. There was a pause. Elena had been my supervisor for 3 years. She knew me well enough to recognize when something significant was happening. Everything okay? She asked. Everything's fine. I'm just ready for a new challenge. After I hung up, I started making lists. Things to pack, arrangements to make, people to notify. Practical details that gave me something to focus on besides the echo of laughter in my head. The Guatemala assignment was exactly what I needed, remote enough that communication with home would be minimal, demanding enough to require all my attention, important enough to remind me why I'd chosen this work in the first place. I'd be working with a team to establish temporary water treatment systems in areas where the infrastructure had been destroyed by mudslides. It was the kind of work that saved lives directly and immediately, the kind of work that reminded you what actually mattered. My phone kept buzzing with messages from family members, each one trying to minimize what had happened, to convince me that Dad's public mockery was just another misunderstanding in a long series of misunderstandings. I turned it off. For the first time in years, I felt completely clear about what I needed to do. I needed distance from people who saw my work as a failure instead of a calling. I needed space from family members who expected me to absorb humiliation quietly to maintain everyone else's comfort. Most importantly, I needed to stop seeking approval from someone who had demonstrated repeatedly that he would never give it, someone who seemed to derive satisfaction from withholding it. The Guatemala deployment would give me all of those things. 6 months minimum, potentially longer if the situation required it. 6 months to remember who I was when I wasn't performing the role of disappointing daughter at family gatherings. I spent the next 2 days making arrangements with the efficiency that came from years of last-minute deployments. Subletting my apartment, arranging for mail forwarding, updating my emergency contacts to list Elena instead of my parents. I didn't call anyone to explain my decision. I didn't owe anyone an explanation for choosing work that would take me away from people who had made it clear they didn't value what I contributed. Guatemala was exactly what I needed, demanding enough to occupy every moment of mental energy I might have otherwise spent replaying family dynamics. Our base was a converted school building in a town that had been essentially cut off from outside resources for 3 months. My job was coordinating between international aid organizations, local government officials, and community leaders to establish systems that could function long-term. The work was complex beyond anything I'd done before. We weren't just providing emergency relief. We were rebuilding infrastructure from the ground up in areas where the original systems had been completely destroyed. I worked 18-hour days analyzing topographic surveys, negotiating with contractors, training local technicians who would maintain the systems after our team moved on. Every decision had immediate, visible consequences for thousands of people. My phone stayed off most of the time. Communication with the outside world happened through Elena, who handled the organizational logistics and family contact protocols I'd established before leaving. Your mother called, she mentioned during one of our weekly check-ins. She wanted to know when you're coming back. What did you tell her? That your assignment is open-ended and depends on project needs. The relief I felt at having that boundary maintained was immense. I didn't want to explain my decision to leave, didn't want to defend my choice to prioritize meaningful work over family obligations that had become toxic. 3 months into the deployment, we achieved something remarkable. The water treatment system we'd installed was not only functional, but had become a model for other reconstruction efforts throughout the region. International observers were coming to study our approach. That's when the media attention started. It began with a local news crew documenting the reconstruction efforts. Then a documentary filmmaker who was following international aid work included our project in her film. Then journalists from major news outlets started requesting interviews about sustainable infrastructure in disaster zones. I didn't think much of it initially. Media coverage came with most large-scale aid projects. People liked stories about communities rebuilding after disasters, and our work was visually compelling, clean water flowing in places where there had been nothing but mud and debris months earlier. But this felt different. The questions reporters were asking weren't just about the technical aspects of what we'd accomplished. They wanted to know about the decision-making process, the coordination challenges, the leadership structure that had made such complex work possible. Elena mentioned that news outlets in the United States had picked up the story. "You're getting quite a reputation," she said during one of our calls. "People are talking about your work at the highest levels of disaster relief coordination." I was too focused on the immediate challenges to pay much attention to external recognition. We were expanding the program to 2 additional communities, each with unique geographical and political complications that required completely different approaches. But the media attention kept building. What had started as local interest became regional, then national, then international coverage. My name started appearing in articles about innovative approaches to disaster relief. The irony wasn't lost on me. While my family was labeling me unemployed and directionless, I was being recognized internationally for exactly the kind of work Dad had always dismissed as impractical. My phone finally rang with a call I couldn't ignore. Elena's voice was different, more formal than usual. "There's been a development," she said. "CNN wants to do a feature story about the Guatemala project. They're calling it a breakthrough in sustainable aid delivery. They can interview the whole team," I said. "This wasn't a solo effort. They specifically want to focus on your role in coordinating the multi-organizational response. Apparently, some policy experts are calling your approach revolutionary." The word revolutionary felt foreign applied to work I'd been doing in various forms for years. But Elena explained that the combination of technical innovation, community involvement, and long-term sustainability planning we'd implemented was being studied by aid organizations worldwide. That's when she mentioned the timing of the broadcast. "It's going to air this Sunday during their international news segment." Sunday. The same day as family dinner at Mom's, the same gathering I'd been missing for months, the same group of people who'd watched Dad label me unemployed and laughed along with his assessment of my life. The CNN report aired at exactly 6 o'clock Eastern Time, right when my family would be sitting down to Sunday dinner. Elena called me immediately after the broadcast to read me the headlines it was already generating. "Unknown hero identified. The woman behind Guatemala's water miracle," she read from her laptop. That's the CNN homepage banner right now. My phone started buzzing incessantly, messages, calls, notifications from news outlets requesting interviews. Elena was fielding most of them, but she couldn't filter everything. The story had captured public attention in ways I hadn't anticipated. Social media was exploding with shares and comments. News organizations were racing to cover angles the CNN piece hadn't explored. Policy experts were calling for congressional hearings about funding similar projects. "You need to see this," Elena said, and I could hear her typing. "The State Department just released a statement calling your work exemplary service in the highest traditions of American humanitarian aid." I was sitting in the converted classroom that served as our command center, looking out at a community where children were playing in streets that had been impassable rivers of mud when I'd arrived. The transformation was visible everywhere: rebuilt homes, functioning infrastructure, people who had hope again because they had clean water and working sewage systems. But all I could think about was Sunday dinner happening 3 time zones away, my family gathering around the same table where Dad had spent years dismissing this exact work as evidence of my failure to launch. My personal phone had 17 missed calls from my mother, 12 from my sister, 6 from Dad. I didn't listen to any of the voicemails. Instead, I called Elena back. "What exactly did the CNN report say about me?" She read me the key section. "The coordinator of this remarkable achievement is a 31-year-old American aid worker whose innovative approach to disaster relief has caught the attention of international development experts. Her name, until now unknown to the general public, is my name on national television." Connected to work that was being described as groundbreaking, innovative, revolutionary, all the words that had never been applied to my career in family discussions. The phone rang again. Dad's number. This time I answered. "Jesus Christ," he said without preamble. "Why didn't you tell us?" His voice was different from any tone I'd heard from him in years. Not dismissive, not condescending. Something closer to awe, maybe shock. "Tell you what? About the CNN thing. About Guatemala. About any of this." I could hear voices in the background. My family was clearly gathered around the phone, probably the same living room where he'd made his announcement about my unemployment months earlier. "You didn't ask," I said. "But this is incredible work you're doing." The reporter said governments are trying to replicate your model. "It's the same work I've been doing for years." There was a long pause. I could picture him processing this information, trying to reconcile the international recognition with his narrative about my poor life choices. "When are you coming home?" he asked. "I'm not sure. But you have to come back eventually, right? I mean, there must be opportunities here now, with this kind of publicity." And there it was. He was already trying to figure out how to use my unexpected success for his own purposes, how to transform my international recognition into local bragging rights for himself. "I have to go," I said. "We have a community meeting in 5 minutes." "Wait, can we?" I hung up. Elena knocked on the door frame. "The president of Guatemala wants to meet with you tomorrow. Also, the UN Development Program is requesting a briefing about replicating this model in West Africa." I looked out the window again at the children playing in the street, at the water pumps that were functioning because we'd designed systems that could be maintained locally, at the community that existed because complex technical problems had been solved through careful coordination and sustained effort. This was my life. This was my work. This had always been my work. The difference was that now the world was paying attention. I extended my deployment twice, ultimately staying in Guatemala for 10 months. The work kept expanding, additional communities requesting similar infrastructure development, other organizations wanting to study our methods, government officials from multiple countries visiting to observe our approach. When I finally returned to the United States, I was a different person than the one who had left. Not because of the media attention or professional recognition, but because I'd spent almost a year working without the constant background noise of family judgment. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen for my capabilities rather than my deficiencies, to have my expertise valued rather than questioned, to be part of conversations where my contributions were welcomed rather than tolerated. Dad tried to reach out several times during those final months. Phone calls, emails, messages through my mother. Each communication followed the same pattern, attempts to minimize the previous tension, efforts to claim some credit for my success, invitations to family events where he could show me off to the same people who had witnessed my humiliation. I didn't respond to any of them. The person who had sought his approval for so many years felt like someone I used to know, someone whose priorities I could remember but no longer shared. The work had reminded me who I was when I wasn't performing the role of disappointing daughter. My flight home landed on a Tuesday afternoon. Elena picked me up from the airport, and we drove straight to the organization's headquarters for debriefings that would determine future assignments. "There's significant interest in having you lead a multi-country program in Southeast Asia," she told me as we walked through the building. "It would be a 2-year commitment, but the scope is unlike anything we've attempted." "Tell me about it." The proposal was ambitious beyond anything I'd imagined, coordinating disaster preparedness infrastructure across 6 countries, working with governments, international organizations, and local communities to establish systems that could respond to natural disasters before they became humanitarian crises. "It's preventive rather than reactive," Elena explained. "Building capacity before disasters strike instead of responding afterward." The scope was daunting, but the potential impact was enormous. Successfully implemented, the program could prevent the kind of devastation I'd spent years helping communities recover from. "When would it start?" 6 weeks. Just enough time for you to handle personal business and complete the transition planning. Personal business. The phrase felt foreign. My apartment had been sublet successfully. My possessions fit into 2 suitcases and a storage unit. I didn't have personal business in the conventional sense. What I had were relationships that needed resolution, family dynamics that needed clear boundaries, and a decision to make about what kind of contact I wanted with people who had spent years making it clear they didn't understand or value what I contributed to the world. My mother called that evening, before I'd even unpacked. "You're back," she said, relief evident in her voice. "When can we see you?" "I'm leaving again in 6 weeks. Silence. "Then, leaving for where?" "Southeast Asia." "It's a long-term assignment." "How long-term?" 2 years minimum. Another pause. I could hear Dad in the background asking her questions, trying to understand his side of the conversation. "Don't you think," she said carefully, "that it might be time to consider settling down? After all this success, surely there are opportunities here now." The same assumption that had always frustrated me, that my work was something I'd eventually outgrow, a phase I'd move past once I got serious about building a real life. Even now, with international recognition and career opportunities that exceeded anything I'd imagined, they still saw my choices as temporary, my path as something that needed correcting. "This is settling down," I said. "This is my career. But what about family? What about finding someone, having children of your own? What about the families I'm helping by doing work that prevents disasters from destroying their communities?" She couldn't understand that prevention of suffering was just as meaningful as creation of new life, that serving communities I'd never meet was just as valuable as serving relatives who had made it clear my contributions weren't welcome. "Your father wants to talk to you," she said finally. "I'm sure he does. He's very proud of what you accomplished." "Is he proud of the work, or proud that other people finally recognize it?" She didn't answer, which was an answer in itself. "I need to go," I said. "I have calls to make about the next assignment." The final conversation happened 3 days before I was scheduled to leave for Thailand, where I'd be establishing the program's coordinating headquarters. Dad showed up at my apartment without calling first. I opened the door to find him standing in the hallway holding a newspaper with my picture on the front page, a follow-up story about the Guatemala project that had run in the local paper. "Can we talk?" he asked. I let him in but didn't offer coffee or suggest we sit down. He looked around the mostly empty apartment, taking in the sparse furnishings and packed boxes that represented the extent of my accumulated possessions. "I brought this for you," he said, holding out the newspaper. "Thought you might want a copy." "I have copies." He set it on the counter and looked at me directly for the first time since arriving. "I owe you an apology," he said. "For which part?" "For not understanding what you were doing. For not supporting your choices. For making jokes at your expense. For making jokes in front of other people," I corrected. "That's what this is about. Not the years of private disappointment, but the public humiliation." He was quiet for a long moment. "You're right," he said. "That was wrong." "Yes, it was. But I don't understand why you won't let me make it right." "Because you don't want to make it right. You want to make it go away. You want to pretend it didn't happen so you can be proud of me now that other people are proud of me." His face flushed. "That's not fair. Isn't it? Where was your pride when I was doing this same work without recognition? Where was your support when I was making choices you couldn't understand, but that were clearly meaningful to me? I was worried about you." "No, you were embarrassed by me. There's a difference." He sat down heavily on my couch, suddenly looking older than I'd ever seen him. "Maybe you're right," he said quietly. "Maybe I was embarrassed. Maybe I wanted you to choose a path that would be easier for me to explain to people." It was the first time he'd admitted that his judgment of my choices had been about his comfort rather than my well-being. But it was also 10 years too late. "I spent so much time trying to prove myself to you," I said. "Trying to translate my work into terms you'd understand, trying to justify choices that didn't need justification. I know. I don't need your approval anymore. I haven't needed it for a long time, but it took me leaving to understand that." He nodded slowly, staring at his hands. "So where does that leave us?" "I don't know. I'd like to try to rebuild this," he said. "To understand what you do, to support it properly this time. That's not something you can decide unilaterally. Trust isn't something you can rebuild with good intentions." "What would it take?" I thought about that question seriously. What would it take for me to believe that his change was genuine, that his newfound pride in my work wasn't just a response to external validation? "Time," I said finally. "And proof that you value what I do even when nobody else is watching." "How do I prove that if you're leaving for 2 years?" "That's not my problem to solve." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street below. "I've lost you, haven't I? You never had me in the way you thought you did. You had a version of me that existed to validate your idea of good parenting. The real me, the person who chooses difficult work because it matters, who prioritizes service over security, you never wanted that person. I want that person. Wanting to want something isn't the same as actually wanting it." He turned back toward me. "What if it is? What if this is how change begins?" I didn't have an answer for that. Maybe he was right. Maybe genuine change did begin with recognizing the gap between who you thought you were and who you actually were. But I also knew that I couldn't build my life around the possibility of his transformation. I couldn't postpone my own growth waiting for him to catch up to understanding choices I'd been making for years. I hope you figure it out, I said. But I'm not going to wait around to see if you do. He picked up the newspaper from the counter and looked at my picture one more time. I am proud of you, he said. I know that doesn't mean much coming this late, but I am. I know you are. Now, after he left, I sat in my empty apartment thinking about the conversation. There had been genuine regret in his voice, real recognition of the damage he'd caused. But there had also been an expectation that acknowledgement alone would be enough to reset our relationship. Some wounds healed with time and good intentions. Others required fundamental changes in the dynamics that had caused them. Ours fell into the second category. The flight to Bangkok departed on a Friday morning. I'd said goodbye to my mother and siblings earlier in the week, conversations that were emotional but straightforward. They understood my work now, even if they didn't fully understand my choice to prioritize it over family proximity. Dad didn't come to the airport. I was relieved. The Southeast Asia program launched with a coordination meeting that brought together representatives from 6 governments, for international organizations, and dozens of local community groups. The scope was overwhelming, designing disaster preparedness systems for a region where typhoons, earthquakes, tsunamis, and flooding created constant threats to millions of people. But the work was exactly what I'd hoped it would be. Complex, meaningful, challenging in ways that required every skill I'd developed over years of crisis response. 18 months into the program, we achieved something unprecedented. Early warning systems that actually worked, evacuation procedures that communities could implement independently, infrastructure that could withstand natural disasters that would have been catastrophic under previous conditions. When Typhoon Maria hit the Philippines, communities we'd worked with evacuated efficiently and completely. 0 casualties in areas where similar storms had previously killed thousands. Infrastructure remained functional, recovery time was measured in weeks instead of years. The success generated international attention again, but this time I was prepared for it. Media interviews became part of the job, opportunities to advocate for preventive approaches to disaster relief and sustainable development funding. During one of these interviews, a reporter asked about my family's reaction to my career success. "They're learning to understand what I do," I said. "It's been a process for all of us." It was a diplomatic answer that avoided the more complicated truth that I'd built a meaningful life by stopping the pursuit of approval from people who had never been capable of giving it. That sometimes the healthiest thing you could do for a relationship was to stop needing it to be something it wasn't. My mother sent regular emails with family updates, photos from gatherings I was missing, news about relatives, and neighborhood happenings. Dad was mentioned occasionally, usually in passing references to his health or activities, but he never asked her to convey messages, and I never asked about him specifically. The program extended twice, ultimately running for 3 years. By the time it concluded, we'd established sustainable disaster preparedness systems across 6 countries and trained local coordinators who could maintain and expand the work without international oversight. When I finally returned to the United States, I was offered a position coordinating similar programs globally. The work would involve travel to disaster-prone regions worldwide, but my home base would be in Washington, D.C., working with policymakers and international development organizations. I accepted immediately. The person who had left after Dad's public humiliation had been seeking escape from family dynamics that felt inescapable. The person who returned had built a career around work that saved lives, had been recognized internationally for innovation in humanitarian aid, had created systems that would prevent suffering for generations. I'd stopped needing validation from people who had never understood what I valued. I'd found validation in the work itself, in communities that had clean water because of coordination I'd provided, in families who had survived disasters because of early warning systems I'd helped design. The career I'd built wasn't a response to his disapproval anymore. It was simply the career I'd chosen because it aligned with what I believed mattered most. 6 months after returning, I received an invitation to speak at a congressional hearing about international disaster preparedness funding. My testimony would influence policy decisions that would affect humanitarian aid programs worldwide. I called my mother to let her know about the hearing, mostly because I knew she'd see it on C-SPAN and worry if she didn't understand why I was testifying before Congress. "Your father will want to watch," she said. "That's fine. He asks about you, you know. He follows the news stories about your work." "Okay. I think he'd like to hear from you directly." "I'm sure he would. Would you consider calling him?" I thought about it seriously. 3 years had passed since our last conversation. He'd had time to process what I'd told him about trust and change. He'd had time to demonstrate whether his understanding of my work had developed beyond pride in external recognition. "Has he changed?" I asked. "What do you mean? Does he talk about my work differently now? Does he understand why I make the choices I make?" She was quiet for a moment. "He brags about you to his friends." That's not what I asked. "I don't know how to answer what you asked." That was answer enough. He learned to be proud of my success, but pride wasn't the same as understanding, and understanding wasn't the same as respect for choices that didn't align with his priorities. "I need to go," I said. "I have preparation to do for the hearing. Will you think about calling him?" "I'll think about it." But I already knew I wouldn't. Some relationships could be repaired with time and effort. Others needed to be accepted for what they were rather than transformed into what you wished they could be. I'd built a life that no longer required his approval, no longer needed him to understand my choices, no longer depended on his validation of my worth. That life was full of meaningful work, supportive colleagues, and communities around the world where my contributions had made lasting differences. The person who had once desperately wanted her father's pride had been replaced by someone who had found pride in work that mattered, recognition from people who understood its value, and satisfaction that came from aligning choices with convictions rather than seeking approval from others. That transformation wasn't revenge in any conventional sense. It was something better. It was freedom. The congressional hearing took place on a Tuesday morning in October. I sat at the witness table in a room I'd only seen in news footage, looking out at senators who would decide funding levels for international disaster relief programs that affected millions of people worldwide. My testimony lasted 45 minutes. I presented data about prevention costs versus response costs, shared case studies from communities where early intervention had prevented catastrophic losses, outlined policy recommendations that could save both lives and money on scales that were difficult to comprehend. Senator Williams from Texas asked pointed questions about accountability measures. Senator Chin from California wanted specifics about replicating successful programs in different geographical contexts. Senator Rodriguez from Florida focused on hurricane preparedness applications for coastal communities. These were serious people asking serious questions about work I'd spent years developing expertise in. The conversation was substantive, focused, productive in ways that reminded me why I'd chosen this career path originally. During the lunch break, I checked my phone and found 17 missed calls from my mother. "I saw you on C-SPAN," she said when I called back. "You were incredible up there." "Thank you. Your father watched too. He called me afterward and said he finally understood what you've been doing all these years." I felt that familiar wariness that came whenever Dad's sudden comprehension was mentioned. "What did he say exactly?" "That watching you explain your work to senators made him realize how important it really is. How much expertise you've developed. How wrong he was about your choices." "And what did you tell him?" "That he should call you himself if he wants you to know that." It was a small boundary, but an important one. She'd stopped serving as the intermediary for communications he was too proud or too uncertain to initiate directly. "Has he?" I asked. "Has he what?" "Called me himself." "Not yet." The afternoon session focused on budget allocations and implementation timelines. By the time the hearing concluded, I was exhausted but satisfied. The senators had demonstrated genuine understanding of the issues, asked informed questions, seemed genuinely committed to funding programs that could prevent humanitarian crises rather than just responding to them. Outside the Capitol building, I was approached by a woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Maria Santos, a reporter for the Washington Post. "I've been following your work since the Guatemala coverage," she said. I'm working on a piece about career paths and international development. Would you be willing to talk about how you got into this field? We arranged to meet the following week at a coffee shop near my office. The interview was supposed to last an hour, but stretched to nearly 3 as she asked detailed questions about the trajectory from college idealism to practical expertise, from family resistance to international recognition. What would you tell young people who want to do similar work but are getting pushback from family about career stability? She asked near the end of our conversation. I thought about that question seriously. It was the question I wish someone had answered for me 10 years earlier. That meaning and security aren't opposites, I said finally. That doing work you believe in doesn't mean accepting instability or poverty. But it might mean accepting that some people won't understand your choices, even people whose opinions matter to you. Including family? Especially family, sometimes. The people closest to you often have the strongest opinions about who they think you should be. The article ran 2 weeks later under the headline, Building Bridges: How One Aid Worker Turned Family Disappointment into Global Impact. It was a thoughtful piece that focused on the professional development aspects of my career rather than the personal family dynamics, but it did include the quote about meaning and security. My mother called the day it was published. That was a beautiful article, she said. Very respectful. I was pleased with how it turned out. Your father read it too. I waited for her to continue, but she didn't elaborate. And? He said it helped him understand some things he hadn't understood before. Such as, about why you made the choices you made. About what you were trying to accomplish. It was progress, I supposed. Understanding was better than dismissal, even if it had taken international recognition and a newspaper article to achieve it. 3 months later, I received an unexpected email. The subject line was simply from Dad. I stared at it for several minutes before opening it. Dear Beatrice, it began, using the formal tone he'd always employed for serious written communication. I've been thinking about our last conversation for 3 years now. About what you said about trust and proof. I think I finally understand what you meant. The email continued for several paragraphs. He acknowledged specific incidents of undermining my choices, recognized the pattern of public criticism, admitted that his disapproval had been about his own insecurities rather than genuine concern for my well-being. I can't undo the damage I caused, he wrote. But I want you to know that I've been following your work closely, not because other people recognize it now, but because I'm trying to educate myself about what you actually do. I've read articles about disaster preparedness, watched documentaries about humanitarian aid, even attended a lecture at the community college about international development. That detail surprised me. Dad attending a lecture about international development seemed as unlikely as him taking up ballet. I'm not asking for forgiveness, the email concluded. I'm not asking you to come home or call me or pretend the past didn't happen. I just wanted you to know that I understand now why you made the choices you made, and I respect those choices. I should have respected them years ago. I read the email 3 times before closing my laptop. The next morning, I drafted a response. Dad, I wrote. Thank you for the email. I appreciate you taking the time to educate yourself about my work. That means more to me than you probably realize. I paused there, uncertain how much more to say. The email represented genuine effort on his part, a willingness to admit error and take concrete steps toward understanding. But it also came years after the damage had been done, years after I'd learned to build my life without his approval. I'm not ready to rebuild our relationship, I continued. But I'm glad you're working to understand what I do and why I do it. That's a good start. I sent it before I could second-guess the decision. His response came within hours. That's fair. I'll keep working on understanding. I love you. It was the most honest exchange we'd had in years, maybe ever. Not a reconciliation, not a resolution, but an acknowledgement of where we actually stood rather than where we pretended to stand. 6 months later, I was offered a position as Director of International Disaster Preparedness for the United Nations. It would mean relocating to Geneva, overseeing programs across multiple continents, working at the highest levels of international policy. I accepted immediately. The night before my departure, my mother called to say goodbye. Your father wanted me to tell you something, she said. He said to tell you he's proud of the work you're doing, not because other people recognize it, but because it saves lives. He said he finally understands that's what matters. Did he say that, or are you interpreting what he said? Those were his exact words. It was a small victory, perhaps meaningless in the larger context of our relationship. But it represented something I'd waited years to hear, acknowledgement that the value of my work wasn't determined by external recognition, that saving lives was sufficient justification for choices that had never made sense to him before. "Thank you for telling me that," I said. "Are you happy?" she asked suddenly. "What do you mean?" "With your life. With your choices. Are you happy?" I looked around my apartment, mostly packed again, ready for another international move, another challenging assignment, another opportunity to do work that mattered on scales I was still learning to comprehend. "Yes," I said. "I'm exactly where I want to be." And for the first time in my adult life, that answer had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. Geneva proved to be everything I'd hoped for professionally and nothing I'd expected personally. The work was more complex than anything I'd managed before, coordinating disaster preparedness initiatives across 43 countries, managing budgets that exceeded some nations' GDP, working with heads of state who called me directly when crises threatened their populations. But the city itself felt surprisingly lonely. Not because I lacked colleagues or professional relationships, but because success at this level came with a kind of isolation I hadn't anticipated. Few people understood the scope of what I managed daily, the weight of decisions that affected millions of lives, the constant awareness that systems I designed were the difference between survival and catastrophe for communities I'd never visit. My apartment overlooked Lake Geneva, with views of the Alps that never stopped being breathtaking. But I found myself working 16-hour days not because the job required it, but because work had become the only context where I felt fully understood, fully valued for exactly who I was. 8 months into the position, I received an unexpected visitor. Elena appeared at my office door on a Tuesday afternoon, grinning like she had a secret. "Surprise audit from headquarters," she announced, settling into the chair across from my desk. "You didn't fly to Geneva to audit my programs, correct?" "I flew to Geneva to convince you to come back to field work." Elena explained that a consortium of international organizations was launching an unprecedented program, a 5-year initiative to establish disaster-resilient infrastructure across the Pacific Ring of Fire. The scope was massive, the timeline ambitious, the potential impact enormous. "They want you to lead it," she said. "Full autonomy, unlimited resources, hand-picked team. It's everything we've talked about for years, prevention on a scale that could fundamentally change how the world responds to natural disasters." The opportunity was exactly what I'd dreamed of when I'd first entered this field. Real-time implementation of systems that could save millions of lives, working directly with communities rather than through bureaucratic channels, building something that would function long after I'd moved on to other projects. Where would it be based? Manila initially, but you'd be moving constantly. 6 months in the Philippines, 4 months in Japan, 3 months in Chile, 2 months in New Zealand. Wherever the work takes you. For 5 years. Minimum. Probably longer if it's successful. I looked out my window at the perfectly manicured International District, at the building where policy was made but rarely implemented, where decisions affected millions of people who remained abstractions rather than individuals. When do they need an answer? 2 weeks. That night, I called my mother for the first time in months. The time difference meant reaching her during her morning coffee, a routine I remembered from childhood. "You sound different," she said after we'd covered the basic catch-up topics. "Different how?" "I don't know. Tired, maybe. Or distracted." I told her about the Ring of Fire opportunity, about the choice between staying in Geneva to influence global policy or returning to direct implementation work that would require constant travel and uncertain living conditions. "What does your heart tell you?" she asked. It was the kind of question she'd asked when I was a child facing decisions about school activities or summer camps, but it felt more significant now. That I became good at this work because I love the problem-solving, the immediate impact, the connection to communities that need help. Policy work is important, but it's not why I got into this field. Then you know what to choose. It means I'll be even further away. even less available for family things. Sweetheart, you've been doing this work for 15 years. We've learned to be proud of you from a distance. After we hung up, I sat on my balcony looking out at the lake and thinking about paths not taken. I could stay in Geneva, build a career around influence and policy, eventually become one of those senior officials who shaped international development strategy from conference rooms and corner offices. Or I could go back to the work that had originally drawn me to this field, direct engagement with communities facing existential threats, hands-on problem-solving, the satisfaction of seeing clean water flow where there had been only contamination, watching families return to homes that could withstand disasters that would have destroyed them previously. I'd proven I could succeed at the highest levels of international policy. I'd demonstrated expertise that world leaders sought out and respected. I had nothing left to prove to anyone, which meant I was free to choose based on what I actually wanted to do rather than what looked most impressive or what would generate the most recognition. I emailed Elena the next morning. Tell them yes. The transition back to field work felt like returning to a language I'd temporarily forgotten, but still spoke fluently. Within weeks, I was back to living out of suitcases, working 18-hour days in temporary offices, coordinating with local officials who measured success in concrete outcomes rather than policy frameworks. The Philippines team included engineers from 7 countries, community liaisons who spoke 12 languages between them, and specialists in everything from seismic architecture to emergency communication systems. We weren't just building infrastructure, we were creating networks of people who could maintain and expand disaster preparedness long after international funding ended. 6 months into the project, we faced our first major test. A magnitude 7.2 earthquake struck the region where we'd installed early warning systems and reinforced critical infrastructure. The communities we'd worked with evacuated efficiently, building damage was minimal, and recovery operations began within hours instead of weeks. 0 casualties in an area where similar earthquakes had previously killed thousands. That night, sitting in a temporary command center coordinating recovery efforts, I received a text from an unexpected source. Dad's number. Saw the news about the earthquake response. Incredible work. Proud of you. It was the first direct communication from him since the email 3 years earlier. Simple, straightforward, focused on the work itself rather than his own feelings about it. I stared at the message for several minutes before responding. Thank you. The team did amazing work. His reply came immediately. You led that team. Take the credit. It was a small exchange, but it represented something significant: acknowledgement of my leadership, encouragement to own my achievements, recognition that success belonged to me rather than to circumstances or luck. I forwarded the exchange to my mother with a simple note: progress. Her response was equally brief: real progress. 2 years into the Ring of Fire project, we'd established disaster-resilient infrastructure across 8 countries and trained local teams who could replicate our approach independently. The work was succeeding beyond initial projections, communities were safer, and other regions were requesting similar programs. I was offered a promotion that would have moved me back to administrative oversight. I declined. Why? Elena asked during one of our quarterly check-ins. Because this is exactly where I want to be. Leading projects in remote locations, living out of hotels, working with communities that can't pronounce your name, building things that save lives, solving problems that matter, working with people who understand why prevention is better than response. And you're happy? It was the same question my mother had asked before I'd left for Geneva, but the answer felt different now. I'm useful, I said. I'm doing work that aligns with everything I believe matters. I'm surrounded by people who share those values. If that's not happiness, it's something close enough. That evening, I called my mother to share news about the project's expansion into 3 additional countries. Your father asks about your work all the time now, she mentioned near the end of our conversation. What does he ask? Technical questions mostly. He's been reading about earthquake engineering and tsunami warning systems. He wanted to know how the early warning networks actually function. The image of Dad researching seismic monitoring technology was so incongruous with my childhood memories that I almost laughed. Does he understand the answers? He's trying to. He bought books. Books. Physical books about disaster preparedness, purchased and presumably read by someone who had once dismissed this entire field as impractical idealism. Tell him he can call me if he has questions, I said. Really? Really? It was a small door opening, an acknowledgement that maybe enough time and genuine effort had passed to allow for different kinds of conversations than we'd ever managed before. Whether he'd walk through that door remained to be seen. But for the first time in years, I was curious rather than defensive about the possibility. That's where I left it, doing the work I believe in on my terms. If you've ever had to draw a hard line with family, I'd like to hear your story. Have you been publicly belittled by someone you supported? What did you do next? Where's your boundary now, and what would you tell your past self before you said it? Do you think trust can be rebuilt after public humiliation, or is distance the healthiest choice? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this resonated, tap like, subscribe for more true boundary-setting stories, and share this with someone who needs a reminder that respect isn't optional.